The name of this sermon is A Double Agent. If you read mystery novels, you've heard of a double agent. He's an agent of a foreign country that comes over here, and he gets turned, and now he's working for us. There's a story about Shoeless Joe Jackson. Shoeless Joe was considered the best baseball player of all time. But he got mixed up in something that ruined his career. The World Series was about to finish up, and 7 of his teammates took a bribe to throw the game so that the people who were betting on the game would make a lot of money because their team was going to win. And so it's unclear whether he was the 8th and he took the money, but history shows that he didn't have any errors in the game. His batting average was .375, and he got 12 hits on base. No one has ever done that again from the time he did it till 1964. It was a record he held in a game that he was supposed to have thrown. Well, all of the players were never allowed to, they were fined and never allowed to play baseball again. And he was too. But this is why I call him a double agent. There's people on one side that say, no, he didn't do it, and people on the other side that say there's proof he did. And history has called him a double agent because they have made parks and buildings named after him, and over and over again people have said it's time that you put him in the Baseball Hall of Fame. But he hasn't been yet. Well, people can't decide if he's a good guy or a bad guy. Well, the Bible has stories, lots of stories of double agents. I'm going to read you a couple. There's lots more, but I only have time for 2. In 2 Kings, there's a story of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was the guy that had a sickness that he had to go and get cured, and he went to Israel, and he met Elisha. And in 2 Kings 6, verse 17, he tried to give him something. Thank you for curing my leprosy. And Elisha said no. Then Naaman said, if not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mule loads of earth. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings, nor will he sacrifice to any other gods but to the Lord. In this manner may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this manner. He was a double agent. When he left, he was full on a worshiper of Rimmon, but when he went back, he only would do worship God and God only. Well, there's another story in 2 Samuel. You see, Absalom had decided to be king, and he rebelled against David the king, and now Absalom was coming. And David and all the people that were faithful to him left. This is in 2 Samuel, verse 16, chapter 15. Anyway, he had an older man who was a counselor for him. And in verse 32 it says, it happened as David was coming to the summit, when God was worshipped, behold, Hushai, the Archite, met him with his coat torn and dust in his head. And David said to him, if you pass over with me, then you will be a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I've been your father's servant in times past, so I will be your servant. Then you can thwart the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And in the next chapter, in 17, it says, in verse 7, it says, and Hushai said to Absalom, this time the advice that Ahithophel has given you is not good. And he goes on to explain to him that David is a warrior from his youth, and he will not be caught unawares. And see, they were going to take an army of 12,000 men and attack immediately. And it would be all over, and everyone would be fine. Well, God was with him, and the guy, Ahithophel, his advice was not taken, and he was so upset that his really good advice was not taken that he went out and strangled himself and died. Now, the point is, he did this and he saved the king's life, and the other advisor was no longer part of the story. Now, there are other stories and characters in the Bible that started out on one side and switched to the other side, or they had all appearance of switching to the other side. They were double agents. Well, Saul is one of those people. Double agents, if you like, who came over from the dark side to serve Jesus. Even when Saul was doing the wrong things, he was still serving God. And God was using him to achieve his purposes. Just shows again that God is sovereign in everything that happens. Well, let's look at Saul. Verse number 1 is, go ye therefore. 8 verse 1 says, Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death. And on that day a great persecution began against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. And some devout men buried Stephen and made loud lamentations over him. But Saul began ravaging the church and entering from house after house and dragging out men and women, and he put them in prison. Now, Jesus' last commandment was go into all the world and preach the gospel to every nation. And it wasn't a suggestion. It's called the Great Commission. It was first and foremost their directive, what they're supposed to do. He didn't even command them to build a church. If you remember, he said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He didn't even give them that. He said, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Well, to be fair, if you remember the first 7 chapters of Acts, there was a lot of things going on in the church. They were growing by leaps and bounds. They had to expand who was looking after the widows. If you remember, Stephen got the job of looking after the widows. He and 6 others. But even if he hadn't been killed, as it says in verse 1, how Saul was in agreement that he would be killed. Even if he wasn't, he would have lost his job. Because it says that in verse 1, that the church was scattered throughout all the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. So that great big church of maybe 8,000 people dropped to 12. Or dropped dramatically. And on top of that, in verse 3 it says that those, the people that hadn't left were arrested and put in jail. Men and women both. So Stephen was looking after widows, and there wouldn't be any widows. They'd be in jail. Now, one of the textbooks I read, I brought it here, part of my lay pastor course, quite thick, but this is called Christian Movement, Perspectives of the Christian Movement. It's about missionaries. And in it, he's got this story, which I won't read to you because it goes on and on and on, but the story is that God told his followers to go into all the world and preach the gospel. And sometimes they were a little bit hesitant. And they said, I don't want to do it. In the case, and he brings up this case of Saul. Saul made that whole I don't want to do it immaterial because they had to leave. They were being persecuted. And if you read on in verse 8, it talks about them going into Samaria and teaching and spreading the gospel to the Jews there and to the Samaritans. And he goes on to talk about the Vikings. Now the Vikings, no one wanted to go see the Vikings. Christians didn't want to because they were very, very ruthless and violent and all those things. And God said, go into all the world. Go to the Vikings. No one went. So God fixed that by sending the Vikings to them. And the Vikings attacked and decimated their communities, and the Christians all went off as slaves to the Vikings. And in 100 years, they brought the gospel to the Vikings. And 300 years later, they were Christian communities. Norway and Sweden and all those places were Christian communities because they didn't want to go into all the world and preach the gospel, but they went anyway, even as they went as slaves. Now, number 2 is, you're done now. You're done. Just done. Chapter 9 says, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogue of Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Well, you could rightly say that Saul did what God wanted to happen. He wanted all the Christians to move over to Jerusalem and go spread the gospel, preach the gospel around the world. And he did that. And it reminds me of sometimes we have a job that's a temporary job, and it should end. I was at the French conference in Moncton 12 years ago, and they had booths of all the government agencies. And one of the booths was the Indian Affairs. And they printed a 50-page book with pictures, and they told me that the natives were going to get their self-government, and their land claims would be settled, and it would all be fixed. And I said, and that means you're all on the job. And they didn't wait a second. No, stop talking stupid, man. They're not going to be out of the job. This is a retirement plan. This is never going to end. I remember talking about UN, which is another place where they got wasteful. Let your job's done, stop. They set up temporary committees in the early 1960s to do a little project. 6 months, 3 months, 6 months. 60 years later, that committee is still there's people still working on that, and they're still being paid. You see, sometimes we need to let it go. Saul had no idea that his activities were doing exactly what Jesus wanted done. He was helping Jesus build the church, and he didn't even know it. People had fled to all the countries around Judea and were preaching the gospel to the Jews and to others too. We know that if you read the rest of chapter 8, it talks about the Samaritans believing and receiving the Holy Spirit, and it talks about the Ethiopian eunuch who Philip came to, and then he got to bring the gospel to the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians. See, there's certain jobs that have pieces to it. And the first piece of this job for Saul was to get the people out of Jerusalem. Well, there was a second piece. My mother was an arthritic, very, very bad. Her hands, she had no strength in her hands. And so all 3 of us as children were taught to make bread. And if you're making homemade bread, you knead it, And if you knead it too much, it just becomes like a lead. It doesn't, you've popped all the bubbles. It doesn't raise. And so at a certain point, she said, you have to stop. That's enough. Whenever Dad made bread, he kneaded it too much, and it was just bonk. It didn't bounce. Point is, Saul had kneaded the mix enough, and now it was time for him to move on to the next step in the procedure. And he was about to sit out for a while and let it rise. Number 3 is reboot the program. Chapter 9, verse 3. As he traveled, it happened that he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and it will be told you what you must do. And the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days, without sight, neither eating nor drinking. Rebooting the program. Now, if the writer of this book is correct, that Paul was moving the Christians to leave Jerusalem, well, that was done, and so was he. He wasn't allowed. He had a new plan. He was going to expand, and he got as far as the outskirts of Damascus, and that was it for him. There wasn't going to be anybody arrested. There wasn't going to be anybody brought back to Jerusalem, no matter what the papers from the high priest said. He was about to be rebooted. His programming changed. Now, when he started this new adventure, it says in chapter 9, verse 1, breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. He got his letter, and he got his people together, and they traveled. Out of Jerusalem they went toward Damascus. Now, he brought along his muscle to do the dirty work. And I never thought about this before, but what do those guys do? What are they thinking? Now, obviously, they're not the leader. They're the helpers. They're the hired help. And all of a sudden, there's a bright light. They hear a voice saying, It's Jesus, and why are you persecuting me? And I'm going to tell you what you must do. And now Saul is blind. And they've got to be thinking to themselves, we picked a bad job today. This is not a good look. Here we are persecuting the followers of Jesus, and Jesus just showed up and told us, our boss, that we're doing wrong. And my question I thought about was, would these guys just abandon him and leave? Or would they stick around and wait for him? He's the boss. What are we going to do? And what must they have thought that 3 days later when he said, look, I'm no longer chasing Christians. I'm a Christian. And I'm releasing you. And now he's going back to Jerusalem. These guys, how many ever there were, 6 or 8 or 10, they're going back to Jerusalem with a story. And this is not good. They're discussing along the way, what are we going to do here? We were sent to look after Saul. We were sent to look after Saul, and now we've lost him. Not only is he not doing what he said he was going to do, what the letters call for, he's become a Christian. And we're responsible. And so they got back to Jerusalem, and they met the leaders of Jerusalem and said, oh, by the way, we lost Saul that we were supposed to look after, and on top of that, there was a bright light come, and Jesus, the one who you say isn't alive, spoke to him and blinded him. Do you remember the story of the men who were commissioned to look after the tomb. And the angel came, and they were scared stiff. And then they came and told the story, and they got some money, and they said, don't tell anybody the real story. I wonder if these men got some money too. Don't be spreading that around. Don't be telling that Jesus showed up and changed Saul. Just keep it quiet. Here's the money. I wonder. Well, if you continue on over to verse 15, this is with Ananias was sent. But the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. Now, if you'd asked Saul a week before this, listen, what do you think? I got an option for your new life. You're going to be a follower of Christ, and you're going to go to those accursed Gentiles and convince them to be the same. And he would have sworn at you whatever appropriate words that they used for swear words and said, no, and that's not going to happen at all. But God knows what is your part of the story. Verse 16 are really scary words. If you remember the rest of the story, it says, for I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. He got to understand that there would be whippings and prisons and stonings and shipwrecks and a lot more that was going to happen to him to follow Jesus. And he didn't flinch from it. He was willing to trade the praise of men for the hard things God showed him. Whatever you can say about Saul before he became Paul, he had a stout heart. When he got his legs under him, he was on his way. So 3 days without food and drink, and we got the news that his days of being the golden boy were all over. You see, he was the up-and-coming star. That was over. He would be long dead before people would start praising him again. Religious leaders. Well, some people's drug is the honor of praise of their peers. And Saul had bucket loads of that. And now he didn't have any of it anymore. And if you continue to read, he was sent to Tarsus. And he was out of the picture for years. Far from the praises of men. So what's the conclusion? Well, I read an article in the National Post that said he was doing the very thing he always said is not, you don't do, as a writer, you don't include yourself in the story. This is an op-ed, an opinion article. I'm not a part of it. And he said, but in this case, I'm including myself. Because he'd written other columns that he thought were perfectly reasonable and sensible, and people were coming down hard on him. He was taking a lot of heat for what he said. One of the things he said was, this ban on handguns is not going to work. These are good law-abiding citizens, and it's not going to achieve what you want. He went on to say, those people who have legal handguns are half as likely as the general population to commit a crime. For one thing, they've had a criminal background check by the police. They've had a psychological evaluation, and each one of them had signed affidavits from neighbors that said, this guy's a good guy, he can own a gun. And the police will call you if you sign an affidavit. All of that says they're trustworthy. Well, the proper course of action, if you want to remove gun violence, is stop the illegal guns from coming in from the U.S. into Canada. And he went on in the article to say that 90% of those guns come through native reservations. And I thought to myself, I'd never heard that before. I wonder if that's true. And CBC was playing something on the radio saying that a chief from one of these reservations said it's a big job we can't do this. There's 20 miles of river and there's 50 miles of border between that can come right across. Well, the point he was making is that as a Canadian, as a reporter, he has to be able to say things that people didn't like. He took a lot of heat for this. But he said, if our children and our grandchildren are going to have freedom, we got to be able to say things that people don't like. We got to be able to tell the truth. Even if people don't like it. I was listening to Andrew Clavin, and he said that he came up with a name for it. He called it the Great Shut Up. He said, I don't like what you're saying. These people are saying, I don't like what you're saying, so shut up. I don't care if you're right. I don't care if I should listen. I want my own way. He said the crucifixion of Jesus was an example, the most notorious shut up in history. Jesus had come. He was the Savior. He'd come. And these people have said, you shut up. And they thought, well, we'll crucify him. That'll do it. Well, that didn't do it at all. It was the worst thing they could have done. They didn't silence him at all. And what's becoming the most unpopular in our society is the claims of Christ. We don't want to hear that we don't want you to tell us that that's a sin. Well, you remember Saul. If you continue to read on the next chapters, he was speaking the gospel now, and they had to let him out a window on a rope so he could escape from Damascus from being killed. And he got to Jerusalem, and he was only there a short time, and the Christians made the decision for him that says, you have to leave, or they're going to kill you. Well, as you read this story of Saul, the double agent, you know he didn't back down until they were coming to kill him. And as I say, it was other Christians that made that decision for him. It was eventually, as you read the New Testament, you know they did come good on they're going to kill him, and they did. But it wasn't before he had made started churches all over the Roman world and written half the books in the New Testament. Writer of this story in the National said that right, the one to be able to tell uncomfortable truths must be something we preserve for our children and our children's children if they're going to remain free. He's talking about something that's very important, and freedom is very important, but it's not as important as where you're going to spend eternity. And we can't allow ourselves to be silenced without a fight. They will attempt to shame us by calling us bigots and racists and white supremacists and all manner of other kinds of slurs. If we're not silenced, then there will be some fruit of that. We'll see more double agents, more people who become Christians, and will bound for eternity, heaven bound, and will be on the side of eternity with Jesus. So what's the plan? You're wondering. Well, I haven't got one. You're wondering why don't you have a paper for each one of us to tell us what our part in the plan is going to be? Well, the plan is that speak out loud. Say it out loud and don't be quiet, that the claims of Jesus are true. If we follow Saul's example in this story, we won't back down until there's a real and imminent threat for our lives. Somebody's coming to kill you because you keep talking about Christianity and the claims of the Bible. Well, at that point, then we have to have a conversation with Jesus and decide what we're going to do. We should look at Paul. In verse 5, he said, "Who are you, Lord?" He recognized that this light and this voice was Jesus. He knew the light, and then Jesus said, "Why are you persecuting me?" What he was saying is, if I've got this wrong, you correct me, and I'm willing to learn and hear and be corrected. It's very different from those folks that sent him off, the high priests. They weren't willing to be corrected. If this village and the towns and the cities and the provinces and the country we live in are going to change for the better, we got to do what Paul did. They won't be given a chance to do what Paul did if they don't hear the gospel. And there's a verse that says, if they don't hear, how can they believe? We can't allow ourselves to be corrected, to be silenced, just because they don't want to hear what we were going to say. Knowing Jesus and what he is essential. It's the part that's so important that God said, you're going to have to celebrate communion and remind each one of you that this part is essential. Tell them that I came into all the world to preach the gospel and tell every nation that Jesus died on the cross and rose again, and he shed his blood, and his body was broken for us. And that's what we need to do. We need to have communion to remind us that this message is so important.